There's a pattern in history that has destroyed global superpowers faster than anyone thought possible. In 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed in less than 12 months after centuries of rule. In 1947, Britain still governed a quarter of the planet, yet within 29 years, the empire was functionally finished. In December 1991, the Soviet Union vanished after just 731 days of visible decline, an economy of 286 million people reduced to 15 struggling states. Different centuries, different systems, same ending. Each collapse followed the same sequence: debt, overextension, loss of confidence, political paralysis, then speed, always speed. And right now in 2025, the United States is moving through that exact same sequence stage by stage with numbers that mirror the past and timelines that are getting shorter, not longer. And here's what should terrify you. Every society caught inside this pattern believed it was the exception. Every one of them was wrong. This is the story of how collapse actually happens, why it accelerates, and why the last superpower standing may already be deep inside the final countdown. Before we go through this pattern, you need to understand what collapse actually means. Not in textbooks, in practice. This isn't just about a flag coming down or a government changing its name. It's about when a system stops working, even though it still exists on paper. Laws remain, institutions remain, leaders give speeches, but underneath, confidence breaks, coordination fails, and reality moves faster than authority. At first, collapse looks invisible, daily life continues, markets open, paychecks arrive, but then small failures begin to stack. One sector breaks, then another. Debt grows faster than production, promises multiply faster than resources, and eventually, belief becomes the only thing holding the system together. Here's what people don't understand. Collapse doesn't happen slowly at the end. It happens slowly at the beginning, then all at once. For years, the warning signs are dismissed, explained away, or statistically massaged. Then suddenly, decisions stop working, policies backfire, control mechanisms fail, and the timeline compresses. That's not theoretical. That's documented history. That's what happened to Rome when debasement destroyed trust in currency. That's what happened to Britain when debt and overreach hollowed out its industrial base. That's what happened to the Soviet Union when economic reality finally overpowered political denial. This pattern doesn't care about ideology. It doesn't care about military strength. It doesn't care about confidence or rhetoric. When the inputs are the same, the outputs are the same. Let me show you how it happened before and why it's happening again. Let's start with the Soviet Union. By the late 1970s, it looked permanent. The USSR controlled 22.4 million square kilometers, governed more than 280 million people, and commanded the world's largest standing army with over 5 million active personnel. In 1977, it spent roughly 15% of its GDP on defense, nearly double the American share. On paper, it was indestructible, but the pattern had already begun. The first stage was overextension disguised as strength. By 1979, the Soviet Union was subsidizing allies across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Cuba alone received nearly $5 billion per year in aid. East Germany required constant energy subsidies to remain stable. The Warsaw Pact existed only because Moscow paid for it. The system looked unified, but it was financially bleeding. At the same time, production was stagnating. Between 1976 and 1980, Soviet industrial growth fell below 2% annually. Agricultural output was so weak that by 1981, the USSR was importing more than 40 million tons of grain per year from the United States and Canada. A superpower that couldn't feed itself was hiding behind ideology. Then came the second stage, debt and distortion. To maintain living standards and military parity, the Soviet state quietly borrowed hard currency. By 1985, external debt had reached approximately $30 billion. That sounds manageable until you understand the structure. The USSR earned hard currency almost entirely from oil and gas exports. In 1980, oil accounted for over 60% of export revenue. Then oil collapsed. Between 1981 and 1986, global oil prices fell from roughly $35 per barrel to under $12. Soviet export revenue was cut nearly in half in 5 years. The state didn't adjust spending. It printed, it borrowed, it delayed, and it denied. This is where the pattern truly begins. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev took power at age 54, the youngest Soviet leader in decades. He inherited a system that no longer worked, but could not be openly acknowledged as broken. His response was perestroika and glasnost, economic restructuring, and political openness. The intent was reform. The effect was exposure. By 1987, state enterprises were allowed limited autonomy. Prices were still controlled, but production targets were loosened. The result was predictable. Goods disappeared. Managers hoarded inventory. Black markets expanded. Inflation, officially denied, surged beneath the surface. By 1988, shortages affected basic items in major cities, including meat, sugar, and soap. But here's the critical detail. The Soviet Union did not collapse because reforms failed. It collapsed because reforms revealed reality faster than the system could survive. That leads to stage 3, loss of confidence. In 1989, elections were held for the Congress of People's Deputies. For the first time, Communist Party dominance was publicly challenged. Televised debates exposed corruption, inefficiency, and lies that had accumulated for decades. In the same year, the Berlin Wall fell on November 9th, 1989. Within weeks, Eastern European satellite states began exiting the Soviet sphere. The cost was immediate. By 1990, Moscow was spending billions to prop up failing republics while tax revenue collapsed. Industrial output fell 2% in 1990 alone. Consumer inflation, unofficially estimated, exceeded 140%. The ruble was still stable by decree, but worthless in practice. This is where it gets darker. Stage 4 is political paralysis. By 1990, Gorbachev faced pressure from every direction. Reformers demanded faster change. Hardliners demanded reversal. Republics demanded autonomy. The central government could no longer enforce decisions. In June 1990, Russia itself, under Boris Yeltsin, declared sovereignty over Soviet law. The empire began eating itself. By early 1991, the system was running on fumes. GDP was contracting at nearly 5% annually. Oil production peaked and began to fall. Food rationing returned to Moscow for the first time since World War II. Confidence in the future evaporated. Then came the acceleration phase. On August 19, 1991, hardline communist officials launched a coup against Gorbachev. Tanks entered Moscow. The state attempted to reassert control by force. It failed in 3 days. The coup collapsed on August 22, 1991, and with it, the last illusion of authority. From that moment, the end was inevitable. Republics began declaring independence one after another. Ukraine followed in August, Belarus soon after. On December 8, 1991, leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belavesia Accords, declaring that the Soviet Union no longer existed. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin. The state dissolved. From visible decline in January 1990 to total dissolution in December 1991, the collapse took 731 days. What remained was chaos. GDP fell more than 40% by 1995. Life expectancy dropped by nearly 6 years. Savings were wiped out. Institutions survived in name only. That's what systemic collapse looks like. Not invasion, not apocalypse. Loss of confidence, followed by speed. The pattern says, once legitimacy breaks, time compresses. Let's jump forward more than 40 years. Different continent, different system, same pattern. The British Empire after World War II. In 1945, Britain emerged victorious but exhausted. It still controlled territories spanning roughly 13 million square miles, governing more than 700 million people, nearly a quarter of the world's population. London was still a financial center. The pound sterling was still a global reserve currency. On paper, Britain had won, but the math said otherwise. The first stage was overextension masked by prestige. The war had cost Britain approximately $21 billion, more than 250% of its pre-war GDP. By 1946, national debt exceeded 270% of GDP, the highest level in British history. Maintaining global bases, colonial administrations, and military commitments now required borrowing just to stand still. Just like the Soviet Union decades later, Britain was paying to look powerful. The second stage was industrial hollowing. Before 1914, Britain produced nearly 40% of the world's manufactured goods. By 1950, that figure had fallen below 10%. Factories were outdated. Productivity lagged behind the United States and Germany. Export revenues could no longer support imperial obligations. And just like the USSR's dependence on oil, Britain depended on one thing above all else: confidence in the pound. In July 1944, the Bretton Woods system locked currencies to the US dollar and the dollar to gold. Britain agreed, but the cost was severe. Sterling was now constrained. In 1947, facing a balance of payments crisis, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility of the pound after just 6 weeks. Confidence cracked early. Sound familiar? Stage 3 arrived through debt and denial. Between 1945 and 1951, Britain received $375 billion in Marshall Plan aid. That kept the system afloat, but it didn't fix the structure. Welfare spending expanded. Military commitments remained global. Industrial reform lagged. The state chose stability over competitiveness. Just like the Soviet leadership, Britain delayed adjustment. By 1956, the illusion finally broke. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal in July, Britain attempted to reassert imperial authority through military force alongside France and Israel. The invasion failed politically within days. The United States refused to support the pound. Capital fled. Sterling reserves collapsed. Within weeks, Britain withdrew. This was the moment legitimacy died. Stage 4 was loss of confidence cascading into policy paralysis. After Suez, no British government could credibly claim global leadership. Decolonization accelerated. India was already gone in 1947. Ghana followed in 1957. Nigeria in 1960. One territory after another slipped away, not through defeat, but through insolvency. Just like the Soviet republics later, the empire unraveled from within. By 1967, the pressure reached the currency itself. On November 18, 1967, Britain devalued the pound by 14% overnight, from $2.80 to $2.40. Savings lost value instantly, imports became more expensive, inflation surged, trust eroded. This is where the pattern tightens. In the early 1970s, external shocks exposed internal weakness. The collapse of Bretton Woods in 1971 removed fixed exchange rates. The 1973 oil crisis tripled energy costs. Britain's inflation exceeded 20% by 1975. GDP stagnated. Strikes paralyzed entire industries. Just like the USSR in the late 1980s, the system could no longer coordinate. Stage 5 was humiliation. In September 1976, Britain applied for an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. The amount was $3.9 billion, the largest IMF bailout at the time. In exchange, Britain accepted spending cuts dictated by external authorities. An empire that once financed the world now required permission to balance its own budget. From the first post-war cracks in 1947 to IMF intervention in 1976, the collapse took less than 30 years. Not conquest, not invasion. Loss of confidence, shrinking timelines, accelerating consequences. Different century, different ideology, identical collapse mechanics. The same trap that caught the Soviet Union decades later had already closed once before. And history was repeating itself again. Now let's look at the most recent example. And the most dangerous one to ignore. The Roman Empire in its final accelerated phase. You probably think Rome collapsed slowly over centuries. That's the myth. The reality is much more unsettling. Rome weakened slowly, then failed fast. By the year 180, at the death of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, Rome controlled roughly 5 million square kilometers and governed more than 60 million people. Its roads, legions, currency, and law defined the known world. No rival could challenge it directly. It looked eternal, but the pattern had already begun. The first stage was monetary distortion. To fund a massive military and an expanding bureaucracy, Roman emperors began debasing the denarius. Under Augustus in 14 AD, the silver content was over 90%. By 200 AD, it had fallen below 50%. By 270 AD, it was under 5%. Same coin, same face, almost no silver. The effect was immediate and compounding. Prices rose, trust collapsed. Soldiers demanded higher pay. The state printed more coins to cover costs, which made the problem worse. By 301 AD, inflation was so severe that Emperor Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices, fixing wages and prices across the empire. It failed within months. This is where it accelerates. Stage 2 was military overreach. By the 3rd century, Rome maintained more than 30 legions. Roughly 300,000 soldiers stretched across borders from Britain to Mesopotamia. Defense costs exploded just as revenue collapsed. To compensate, Rome raised taxes aggressively. Small farmers were crushed, trade slowed, local economies began to fail. Just like Britain and the USSR, Rome was paying more to get less. Stage 3 was political fragmentation. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome experienced the crisis of the 3rd century. In just 49 years, there were 26 claimants to the imperial throne. Most died violently. Authority became temporary. Loyalty became transactional. Provinces stopped trusting the center. Sound familiar? The empire split under Diocletian in 285 AD, east and west, as a management solution. It was framed as reform. In practice, it was an admission that centralized control no longer worked. Then came the speed. Between 376 and 410 AD, everything compressed. In 376, Gothic refugees were allowed across the Danube. Poorly managed, they revolted. In 378, Rome suffered one of its worst defeats at the Battle of Adrianople. An emperor, Valens, was killed in battle. That had not happened in centuries. By 401, Rome could no longer pay its troops reliably. By 408, Germanic mercenaries made up a large portion of the army. Loyalty followed payment, not Rome. Then, in August 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. Rome was sacked by Alaric and the Visigoths. The city that had not fallen to a foreign enemy in nearly 800 years was looted for 3 days. From monetary breakdown to symbolic collapse, the final phase took just decades. The Western Roman Empire officially ended in 476 AD when Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed. But the real collapse happened earlier. Trade networks vanished. Urban population shrank by more than 70%. Literacy collapsed. Coinage disappeared from circulation. Rome didn't fall because barbarians were strong. It fell because the system could no longer sustain itself. 3 times. 3 systems. 3 collapses. All following the exact same sequence. And each one happened faster than the last. And here's what should terrify you. The United States is following the exact same pattern. Stage by stage. Decision by decision. Number by number. Stage 1 is overextension disguised as dominance. In 2025, the United States maintains roughly 750 military bases across more than 80 countries. Annual defense spending exceeds $880 billion more than the next 10 nations combined. At the same time, the U.S. guarantees security commitments to Europe, East Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific, just like Rome, just like Britain, just like the Soviet Union, paying more to hold together a system that produces less. Check. Stage 2 is debt replacing production. In 1980, U.S. federal debt was under $1 trillion, about 30% of GDP. By 2000, it reached $5.7 trillion. By 2010, $13.5 trillion. By 2020, $27 trillion. In 2025, total federal debt exceeds $36 trillion, over 125% of GDP. Interest alone now costs more than $1 trillion per year, more than national defense. The state is borrowing simply to service past borrowing. That's not growth, that's survival. Check. Stage 3 is monetary distortion. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve has expanded its balance sheet from under $900 billion to over $9 trillion at its peak. Between 2020 and 2022 alone, more than 40% of all dollars in existence were created. Inflation followed. In June 2022, consumer inflation officially hit 9.1%, the highest in 40 years. Real inflation, measured by housing, food, and energy, was higher. Just like Rome's denarius, same response, same outcome. Check. Stage 4 is dependence on confidence. The dollar remains the global reserve currency, not because of production dominance, but because of trust. Yet that trust is eroding. In 2001, the dollar represented over 70% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 2024, it fell below 58%. BRICS nations openly discuss trade settlement outside the dollar. China and Russia conduct bilateral trade in local currencies. Saudi Arabia signals flexibility on oil pricing. This doesn't mean collapse tomorrow. It means the margin for error is shrinking. Check. Stage 5 is institutional paralysis. Congress fails to pass budgets on time year after year. Debt ceiling crises recur like clockwork in 2011, 2013, 2018, 2021, and 2023. Each time, the solution is delay, suspension, or accounting tricks. Long-term reform is politically impossible. Short-term survival is the only strategy. That's exactly what happened in late-stage Britain, exactly what happened in the USSR. Check. Stage 6 is loss of legitimacy. In 1964, trust in U.S. government exceeded 75%. By 2000, it was around 60%. By 2023, it fell below 20%. Elections are contested, media is distrusted, courts are politicized, federal authorities openly challenged by states, cities, and institutions. When legitimacy fractures, coordination fails. History is explicit on this point. Check. Stage 7 is external shock accelerating internal weakness. In August 2021, the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years, spending over $2 trillion. The collapse of the Afghan government occurred in 11 days. Images of evacuation echoed Saigon in 1975 and Suez in 1956. Symbolism matters in collapse. Allies notice. Rivals notice. Confidence bleeds. Check. Stage 8 is economic pressure reaching the population. Real wages have stagnated since 2000. Housing costs have doubled in many metro areas since 2012. Credit card debt surpassed $1.1 trillion in 2024. Auto loan delinquencies reached levels not seen since 2008. This is where collapse becomes personal. This is where belief breaks. Check. Here's the critical line. We are not approaching the pattern. We are deep inside it. The pattern says once debt service crowds out functionality, once currency credibility requires constant intervention, once institutions lose legitimacy, the timeline compresses. Britain had decades. The Soviet Union had 731 days. Rome had a few decades in its final phase. The speed increases every cycle. Where are we now? Based on the pattern, the United States is in the late middle stage, transitioning toward acceleration. Stage 9 is crisis management replacing governance. Stage 10 is forced restructuring, either through inflation, default, or external reset. Stage 11 is political rupture. Not necessarily collapse of the state, but collapse of the system you recognize. Timeline. Maybe 10 years, maybe 5, maybe less. History never gives exact dates, it gives sequences, and this affects you directly. Your currency loses purchasing power first. Your savings buy less quietly, then suddenly. Your job becomes less secure as instability rises. Your taxes rise, while services degrade. That's not speculation. That's what happened every time before. The pattern says empires don't collapse because people see it coming. They collapse because people assume tomorrow will look like yesterday, until it doesn't. And the most dangerous moment is when everything still looks normal.